The deepest gravitational pull in the human experience is not toward connection, but toward understanding, and this understanding requires a unique kind of stillness. It begins not with a choice, but with a sudden, profound realization that the noise of the external world, the constant demands, the social echoes, the endless calibration of self against others, has become a form of unbearable, low-level static. This is the moment the internal compass recalibrates, pointing definitively inward toward a state of necessary retreat. It is the spontaneous onset of an elective affinity for stillness, a discovery that the self is most potent, most clear, when unobserved and unchallenged by the presence of others. This is the axis upon which a fundamental human preference shifts, moving from the dependency of communal validation to the sovereignty of self-validation. The inherent complexity of maintaining the social self, the mask worn for collective approval, is suddenly weighed against the sheer efficiency and profound peace of authentic being, and the external effort is found to be bankrupting. The individual begins to understand that the energy expended on external performance is a resource that could and should be redirected toward internal cultivation. This redirection is the first, vital step onto the path of solitude, marking the demarcation line between the life lived for appearance and the life lived for essence. The world often mistakes this deliberate withdrawal for a deficiency, a failure to integrate, labeling it as loneliness. This confusion is the primary hurdle one must overcome on the journey inward. Loneliness is an acute, painful state of deprivation, a gaping deficit where desired connection ought to be. It is defined by absence, by a sense of being disconnected from the web of humanity, and it carries the heavy physiological signature of stress and emotional distress. Loneliness is a hunger, a primal evolutionary alarm signal that the relational self is starving. It is a reactive state, born of external circumstance and relational loss, and is characterized by a frantic, often counterproductive, search for external repair. Solitude, however, is its intellectual, emotional, and spiritual inverse. Solitude is a state of psychological fullness, an active, generative, and self-chosen condition. It is not an absence of others, but a presence of self. It is a deliberate, proactive act of stepping away from interaction to facilitate introspection. The solitary individual is not defined by what they lack, but by the abundance of their internal landscape. This is the distinction of maturity. The lonely individual looks outward for completion. The solitary individual looks inward for clarity. To embrace solitude is to recognize that the most vital and necessary relationship is the one with the self, and that this relationship, like any other of consequence, demands devoted, uninterrupted time and attention to thrive. This phase requires an act of intellectual courage, the courage to refute the cultural narrative that equates being alone with being unhappy or failed, and to declare the inherent value of self-contained consciousness. The deepening preference for solitude is inextricably linked to the acceleration of maturity and the construction of an autonomous self. Psychological maturity is defined less by age and more by the shift from alloprospectivity, relying on others for one's sense of worth and direction, to autoprospectivity, deriving worth and meaning internally. The mature self recognizes that external sources of happiness are inherently unstable, susceptible to the whims of circumstance and the inconsistencies of others. True resilience, therefore, must be sourced from an internal, self-replenishing core. Solitude becomes the essential laboratory for constructing this core, facilitating what can be termed cognitive decoupling. Cognitive decoupling is the mental process wherein the individual's thought patterns are freed from the immediate, continuous need to process and predict social variables. In social settings, a significant portion of cognitive resource is devoted to interpretation, reading micro-expressions, anticipating conversational flow, managing identity projection, and monitoring performance metrics. Solitude abruptly terminates these demands. This liberation of mental processing power allows the brain to transition from constant social surveillance to deep, sustained focus. The default mode network, often suppressed by external stimuli, is allowed to activate, facilitating integrated and holistic thought. This translates directly into enhanced problem-solving capacity, the generation of novel ideas that are not merely derivatives of collective wisdom, and a significant improvement in sustained attention span. now unfragmented by the constant context switching inherent in social engagement. The mind becomes sharper, more focused, and less reactive, moving from an externally driven processor to an internally directed generator. Furthermore, in this secluded environment, the mechanisms of dependency are disassembled. The need for constant reassurance diminishes, the reflex to seek consensus is quieted, and the energy previously spent on social negotiation is released for personal development. This period is marked by an increase in decisiveness, a sharpening of personal boundaries, and a profound quiet confidence that no longer requires external corroboration. The mature individual understands that they are the primary architect of their own emotional environment, and solitude is the space where this architecture can be structurally tested and reinforced without the constant vibration of outside interference. This structural testing includes the development of high-fidelity emotional regulation. When emotional states are experienced alone, they cannot be immediately outsourced, projected onto others, or immediately mediated by social distraction. The solitary individual is forced into intimate, honest confrontation with difficult feelings, anxiety, grief, frustration. This confrontation moves the individual past the superficial labeling of emotions and into the nuanced processing of their root causes. The self learns to tolerate emotional discomfort, to observe internal turbulence without reacting impulsively, and to process feelings until they yield insight rather than exhaustion. This self-soothing capacity, developed entirely internally, is the bedrock of true emotional resilience. It is the guarantee that one can handle the complexity of life not because of external support, but because of an unbreakable internal competency. This is where self-authorship is truly established, not just as a concept, but as a lived psychological reality. The spiritual benefits of this dedicated aloneness are manifold and form the true apex of the solitary experience. Stripped of the daily deluge of sensory and social input, the mind begins to experience a dramatic shift in cognitive function. The immediate, tactical, and reactive thinking that dominates social life is replaced by strategic, expansive, and holistic contemplation. This is the birth of true creativity and intellectual innovation. The greatest insights, the most profound connections between disparate ideas, rarely occur in the din of conversation. They emerge from the spaciousness created by an unburdened mind. Solitude facilitates a non-linear form of thinking, allowing the mind to wander through its own archives, making novel associations that would be immediately overridden by the demands of immediate interaction. This process is not merely beneficial, it is essential for the evolution of the self. By turning the gaze inward, the individual engages in uncompromised self-knowledge. The solitary space serves as an echo chamber where one's own values, fears, motivations, and deepest desires cannot be masked or outsourced. The internal dialogue, often suppressed by external obligations, is given full voice. This candid, unfiltered introspection is the foundational work of spiritual growth. It is through this radical honesty that one identifies the true constraints, the inherited biases, and the subconscious patterns that govern behavior. A core benefit of this forensic introspection is the achievement of ethical congruence. Social life frequently requires compromises, minor deviations from core principles to maintain group harmony or avoid conflict. Over time, these small compromises erode the inner sense of moral clarity. In solitude, the individual has the space to examine their actions against their true, unadulterated values. This process establishes an unshakable moral compass, ensuring that future actions taken in the world are perfectly aligned with the internally defined self. This congruence is experienced as profound inner peace and integrity, liberating the individual from the continuous psychic stress of living a fractured, inconsistent life. Only in the absence of witnesses can one truly afford to be their complete, flawed, and glorious self, and subsequently develop the strength to carry that self, intact, back into the world. This leads to a substantial expansion of spiritual growth. Here, spiritual is defined not by adherence to doctrine, but by the cultivation of inner depth, a sense of transcendent connection, and a feeling of being purposefully situated within the cosmos. Solitude is the primary mechanism for transcending the ego's smaller, reactive concerns. When the ego is no longer preoccupied with social status, comparison, or approval, it can begin to dissolve, opening the perceptual field to something larger than the self. This is often experienced as a deepening sense of wonder, an acute sensitivity to the natural world, and a feeling of seamless integration with the flow of existence. The solitary individual begins to perceive the world not as a collection of things to be acquired or people to be managed, but as a unified, living system of which they are an intrinsic and necessary part. This practice of deliberate isolation is, in essence, an advanced form of presence. Without the distraction of external stimuli, one is forced to confront the immediacy of the present moment. The anxieties tethered to the past and the projections tied to the future lose their traction, and the profound, quiet reality of the now becomes the dominant focus. This heightened presence is the spiritual reward. It is a liberation from the tyranny of time and the illusion of constant becoming. In this moment of pure, present-tense existence, the individual discovers the unwavering core of their being, the eternal, unchanging witness beneath the layers of identity and performance. The cycle of growth continues as the solitary being moves from self-reflection to self-acceptance. The flaws observed during introspection are no longer sources of shame requiring social concealment, but simply features of the unique internal topography. This acceptance translates directly into increased empathy for others, paradoxically making the solitary individual a more effective and less needy relational partner when they choose to engage. The relationship is no longer a transaction designed to fill a void, but an authentic exchange of two complete and independent presences. The self-sufficient person is capable of a purer form of love and companionship, free from the burden of requiring the other to complete them. The moments of connection, precisely because they are not desperately needed, become infinitely more precious and meaningful. This entire trajectory, from the initial recoil from societal noise to the final synthesis of internal peace, is marked by a progressive deepening of personal authority. The individual is transformed from a social object, constantly being shaped and defined by the environment, into an autonomous subject, the originator of their own values and meaning. They become their own source of truth, their own steady harbor. The fear of being alone, once a powerful inhibitor, is utterly annihilated, replaced by the profound, comforting knowledge that one is never truly alone, but always in the company of the most comprehensive and fascinating entity they will ever know, their complete self. The happy ending of this narrative is not the sudden reappearance of a perfect social circle, but the quiet, unshakable realization that home is no longer a place to be sought, but a state of being already achieved. The journey into solitude reveals that the internal world is not a barren or terrifying void, but an infinite, self-sustaining ecosystem of thought, feeling, and wisdom, patiently waiting to be explored. The choice to be alone is therefore a decision for richness, for depth, and for the sovereign power of self-definition. It is the ultimate act of self-care and self-trust, leading to an integrated existence where the inner life and the outer world are no longer in conflict, but exist in a state of harmonious and hopeful balance. The stillness sought in retreat becomes the foundation of all future action, ensuring that every step taken back into the world is deliberate, grounded, and fueled by a wellspring that can never run dry. The future is defined by this quiet strength, a permanent reservoir of peace that assures the individual that no external storm can ever truly dislodge their inner foundation. The preference for solitude is not an escape from life, but a deep dive into its most essential truth, emerging stronger, clearer, and utterly whole. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly